You're listening to Parasearch Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or their affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch UK Radio.
So, as I told you, my guest tonight is a lovely friend of mine. I met him for the first time actually at Sage Paracon last November, and some of you may remember the live videos we did where I made him stand 3 steps lower than me on the stairs so that I wasn't actually talking basically into his belly button. It's the wonderful Mr. Barrie John. How you doing, Big Baz?
Big Baz, I'm wonderful, thank you. And you know what, it's great to come on and support you and be here for you. I love it, I really do. But I'm doing good, really good. Just back from Germany.
Yeah, you've been. What were you doing over? Were you near Cologne? Did you say?
No, I was just outside Hanover.
Hanover, that's it.
Yeah, a spiritual convention over there, or a congress as they call them. So it was fantastic. 200 people over the weekend, and a nice event. Really was a nice event.
It's interesting that you were near Hanover. That might link into what I'm going to mention a bit shortly.
Okay.
There you go. That's got you thinking, isn't it? That's got you thinking.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's have a look where we're going to go.
I know. I hadn't even planned that one. It's just off the cuff. I've just thought of that. So, yeah, this is, ad hocing, ad-libbing and all that malarkey. So, we're talking about Coombe Abbey, and I know your Abbey that you're more, shall we say, au fait with, is Newstead
yes.
Abbey. And if I sort of link it in a bit with Newstead, obviously that part of the world, the Midlands, if you like, I call it the more scenic Midlands. I'll probably get shot by anyone who's from the non-scenic Midlands for saying that, but the more scenic the North Midlands, I suppose. Would you call it the North or the South Midlands?
Do you know what? I think we normally call it like the East Midlands.
The East Midlands, okay.
It's one of those, isn't it? It's in the middle of nowhere because we're on the border of Yorkshire. Some people call it North Nottinghamshire. I think it's a real sort of fine line, really, in terms of it.
But the whole sort of Nottinghamshire, Warwickshire, Leicestershire area itself was quite prolific for abbeys and those kind of grand structures. And as we know with Newstead, it was an abbey until Henry VIII came along and decided that religion was only good if they paid homage to him, and he sold it off and it became a country home, didn't it, Newstead?
Yes. Yeah, it did, yeah, very much so. And you see, where we are, we're in the middle of what was the royal hunting ground. You're in the middle of Sherwood Forest, so everybody, kings and queens, used to come to the area and obviously come hunting. That was the whole idea of it. So these priors, these monks, whichever you wish to call them, they were there to entertain royalty as well, and provide that bed for the night, let's call it that.
Which is very similar to the place we're talking about, Coombe Abbey. Because, do you see what I did there? Do you see what I did there? Do you
Brilliant.
see my segue in? Hey. Not just
really
a pretty
clever.
face, Mr. John. I'm not just a pretty face. Anyway, so Coombe Abbey. Obviously, most people will know Coombe Abbey as being the venue for Sage Paracon. It was last year. It will be again this year. And for those of you who haven't read my blog on it, I am going to sort of go back to some of the stuff I wrote in my article that I wrote for the Parasearch website not so long ago. Those of you who had read my blog, there is going to be extra stuff that I've researched since, so don't worry too much. But it was an old abbey. Coombe, as the title would suggest, was an old abbey, and they actually believe it was the most powerful and rich abbey in the whole of Warwickshire. How does that compare then to Newstead as an abbey, from an affluence point of view?
I mean, certainly in terms of size of the building, you know, I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, the first moment that you walk through, you know, into Coombe Abbey through the front door, the place really does take your breath away, and not just from a hotel perspective, but the size of the whole estate, you know, because this really was very impressive. I mean, compared to Newstead, I mean, Newstead isn't anything on the size of Coombe Abbey. So, you know, and everything in there has got a little bit of history in terms of Coombe Abbey, you know, the whole size of the building, when we use the outbuildings, walking around the place, you know, you get this real sort of grandeur feeling, whereas Newstead to me, is more compact.
Right.
You know, it's a lot smaller on basis. So, you know, at Newstead we had 12 to 15 what was referred to as black cannons or Augustinian cannons, you know, and they resided there, and that was their home. So the place wasn't huge compared to Coombe. Coombe shows you money, it shows you value, it shows you worth when you look at it. Yeah. And even the bit where, you know, you're walking down and you go over almost like over the little bridge over the moat, as I call it, where then you go into the forecourt, you know, into the entrance area. And it's just amazing. It really is. You know, it's got one of those feelings that you know that it was grand, put it that way.
It's kind of, I mean, pardon, this is going to sound really trite, what I'm about to say, but it has got a supernatural feeling about it as you're driving up to it. It kind of, almost an out of work, like a ethereal sort of, it appears. Because I remember when I was driving to, I don't know that part of the world. I mean, I can get pretty much anywhere in the UK if I get pointed in the right direction, but I don't know that part of the world intimately. And I was driving along, and suddenly my sat-nav's telling me, it's on your right. And I'm looking, thinking, can't see anything. And I saw this driveway it was telling me to go down. And you're driving down, and you do feel like you've been driving down that driveway for quite a while, and then it appears. And it's almost like someone's just clicked their fingers and it's appeared. I can't really explain it any more than that, but it's sunny. And I remember, it's fortunate there was no one behind me, but I'm driving in and I'm slowing right down before I pulled into the car park, just sitting there going, wow. Yeah. Because it does have that, I mean, I would have said when it was an abbey as well, it must have had a similar sense of sort of grandeur and gravitas as you drove up to it.
Certainly, you know, I mean, and you're right, you know, because, I mean, you know, that was the first time I ever went to it last year, Coombe Abbey, you know, and I remember doing the same as you, and you're driving down this road and you're thinking, well, we're just in a load of trees and woods, you know, and things. And then suddenly this house, you know, Abbey appears at the end of the road, and you think, and it takes your breath, it really does. And I remember, you know, walking up to it across from the car park over the bridge, and yet I actually had to stop and look and think, this is just, I'm just in awe of this place. I did exactly the same thing. Yeah, you know, and then when you go through the door into what obviously is now the hotel reception, you go in there and you just look, and the size, everything is just phenomenal. It really is phenomenal, you know. And I was lucky. I mean, I had one of the rooms in the old part of the house. I call it a house in the Abbey, and you know. And it was amazing, you know, it really was. You could just think, you know, going up this big staircase, going up into the rooms, and it was just outstanding, it really was.
No, I did, I mean, it's like I say in the article I wrote, I did actually go, wow, as I was walking, you know, as I got out of the car and started walking towards it. And I know this, from perception, a place does get bigger the closer you get, but it did suddenly seem to just grow, and it was just, wow. I was thinking, I've got to get in. I'm supposed to be meeting with MJ to start to check what she wants me to do for the day for Parasearch. But part of me just wanted to go walkabout and just walk and touch the stone and absorb it. And I mean, people probably think I'm being paid to be this sort of excited about a building. But anyone who knows me knows that when I find a building that blows my mind away, I can't stop talking about it. So even then I was thinking, this could sound really crude, I can't wait to get in it. I can't wait to sort of feel what it feels like inside, because it feels like it's alive when you look at it. That's another thing. I felt like it almost was watching you. You know those paintings you get that no matter the artist does them so that whatever angle you look at them at, you think you're being watched.
Yeah, you feel the eyes moving. Yeah,
that's how I feel about Coombe Abbey when I was standing outside it. Yeah. I felt it was watching me, and people are probably going, Penny, you drink? Are you drinking? Are you you forgot your meds. No, seriously, that is how it felt, and I know I wasn't the only person who felt like that. So, talking about it as a monastery, one of the shall we say, hauntings that most people talk about there is of a monk who is seen and is meant to cause a bit of chaos in what is now the kitchens by throwing stuff and touching people and being seen to rush up the corridor and everything else. Had you heard of that story?
I had, I had heard of that. And, I mean, I love some of these old classic stories, because what you find sometimes is that when you look into them, there's never actually been any sort of proof behind it. There's no sort of real evidence in terms of it. And let's just say this classic scenario. You're in an abbey. Well, what's the first thing that's going to haunt it? A monk. And it's like, okay, yeah, all right. But yeah, I'd heard that story, and I'd heard of things being thrown and messed about with, etc. But I'm like you. I want to see the proof of it. I'd want to go in there and go, right, come on then, if you're there, I want to see you do this now.
Well, there is credibility to what might be a pissed off monk being there. And that credibility is, a lot of people have attributed this particular haunting to one Abbot Geoffrey, who was actually they say was murdered. So, me being me, I decided to go on a search of the abbots of the Abbey. And I found the sort of British Historical Society type stuff, that the benefit of whenever you're investigating or researching stuff to do with the abbeys is the record keeping is not bad. Because of the fact that monks were pretty much the only literate people around in that time, probably before the sort of mid-1800s, if I'm honest. Yes. And that they would have written things down, things would have been documented, and whilst it's only one person's perspective, the notes are there. And there was an Abbot Geoffrey who was murdered in 1345. No one was ever brought to heel for it, but apparently the murder was so heinous, however you want to pronounce it, or so savage, that the then king, Edward III, actually, and this is documented as well, I read the translation, but the ancient document, screenshots of it, you can actually see, I think it's in the National Archives, actually ordered 6 justices from different counties to investigate who had slain Geoffrey, what had happened. Now, so there is some kind of credence to that story, that there would be an annoyed monk throwing things at people, because, to be honest, if I was running an abbey and I'd been murdered, I'd probably be pretty annoyed too.
Well, I think I would be as well, and I think you'd do your best to let people know, wouldn't you?
Exactly. But I also found stories of some of the monks actually, shall we say, Henry VIII's men didn't treat them too kindly. So maybe it could be one of them. Anyone who had a grudge against people occupying what was their place of worship. Yeah.
And also the home, remembering it was a home to them, wasn't it? So, it's... I totally agree with you,
And it made me... I was talking to my husband about it when we were driving up to Leicestershire this weekend. And I was talking to him about it, and I said, one of the things that sort of I find quite frustrating is when there's a haunting, without any sort of... I mean, we can never prove it. We can't. We don't... it is all speculative at the end of the day. Most of it, you can speculate a bit stronger than others, but it's still speculation. It's like when everyone says they've seen Anne Boleyn. How do they know it is Anne? It could have been one of her ladies in waiting. They would have been dressed not that dissimilarly. They would have walked in a similar way. Their hair would have been styled in a similar way because it was the fashion of the time. But everyone always assumes... It's like when people see what they think is a blonde starlet. Oh, it's got to be Marilyn Monroe. They won't... So could it be that this annoyed monk is the late abbot? But it could also be it was just a monk who happened to live and, maybe die there.
Totally, yeah. Could have died a natural death. Could have just disappeared due to a natural death. You've got no idea, have you, really? And I think a lot of the time we can make it we can almost make the story fit if we're not careful.
You can, yeah, you can shoehorn it
You know, yeah, you can, and I think, but I think when you start looking at it, people want to hold on to that little bit of history, don't they? Onto that little bit of information,
yeah,
and go, right, well, there certainly is something in this, and take it from there, And I think the more, let's say, the more gory or more spooky the story is, the better in a way.
But all good ghost stories have to have a monk. Let's be honest.
Oh gosh, yeah, all the time.
So that one, Jeffrey could be Jeffrey. It's plausible. Hello. Okay, sorry about that. There a little bit of a technical glitch. Barry needs to go and put another 50p in the meter to keep his internet working. Barry, you should have loaded the meter up before we started.
I know, my fault. I apologise. But yeah, I mean, it was in what we were talking about, wasn't it? That it's more fascinating for people when it's got a bit of a gory story to it. The murder of a monk by, let's make up, Henry VIII or whatever. Has more of a story to it than a monk that just died of illness.
Exactly, of old age or whatever it was. But like I say, that is plausible. I mean, there was a lot of violence to the monks and everything during the Reformation, and because the fact some of the should we say soldiers that were sent out were probably basically akin to thugs, as it was. So it is plausible. It could be one of them. It could just be one, as you say, who lived and worked and died there.
Totally. And
is aggrieved that there's other people coming into his house. Who knows? Or it could be Jeffrey. We don't know.
Totally.
I know. Go on.
Yeah, and I know. You see, I find this up at the Abbey. You'd think the first place that would be there, or the first person would be one of the priors of the Abbey. But it's not always the case. It's not always the case, is it? And sometimes it's the unobvious things that tend to happen. So I agree with you, but I think, having that little bit of gore to it, that little bit of mystery, you almost go, blimey, yeah, that must be real then.
The thing is, though, especially as Abbot Geoffrey died in 1345, don't tend to get that many hauntings that go that far back. Do we?
Well, again,
no, I mean, without being sarcastic. I'm not trying to be sort of disrespectful to anyone who does investigation. Gosh, I do it myself. But most of the stories and the reports you read are more likely to have been things that have happened in the last 200, 250 years. Because it's like, I think it was when I was on Paul Ross's radio show and he said, why don't we get dinosaurs? Why don't we get Neanderthal man?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's true, actually. We don't. We tend to not report much post about 1750. But then, is it different because it's a hotel and it's constantly got loads of energy coming through it with all the guests?
I think it's a real difficult one, isn't it? And I agree with you. There's certain things that happens in buildings and you think, well, why don't we get them coming back talking to us? Why is it that, as you know, where I live in the middle of Nottinghamshire, we've got Cresswell Crags, which is, the original sort of Stone Age caves. How many Stone Age men have we got? And number two, I look at that and then think, if they did come back, would they be able to communicate? How would they communicate?
Yeah. That's a whole other conversation.
Totally. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think, also, and we've seen this numerous times, when people go into buildings, sometimes they almost make up the story of a haunting or that there's somebody there waiting for them, when actually, you know what, it never happened.
Yeah. Well, on to 100 or so years later, when King Edward IV actually stayed at Coombe Abbey. It was under as you mentioned with Newstead, that the royalty would come and stay at these abbeys, almost like as a quasi B&B, I suppose, or posh hotel, whichever way you want to look at it. And he was actually the hospitality of an Abbot Alexander when he stayed there. And what he was actually doing, he was travelling to Coventry to actually have a bit of a scrap with his former friend, Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, aka the Kingmaker, who at the beginning of the Wars of the Roses had been the one to get Edward on the throne, and then halfway through it he changed his mind and wanted to get Edward off the throne again. And I was reading up a description of what King Edward IV was like, and apparently he was nearly your height.
Really? Was he?
Apparently so. He was a bit handy as well. Wasn't scared of a bit of a scrap either. Apparently he was the tallest. I think they said he was the tallest king at that point they'd ever had, or something like that. At that point, yeah, he was meant to be 6'4", according to the archives.
And that is a good height in those days.
That's huge.
Yeah, that
in those
really
days.
is.
I mean, the average height would have been about 5'3", 5'4".
Oh, easily. Yeah. So he was certainly a giant in his time, wasn't he? For his time. Okay.
So he stayed there for a little while he was travelling to Coventry.
Yeah. And is he said to haunt it?
He's not, funnily enough.
See, this is the sort of stories that I always think about. So I think, and that's a funny one, isn't it, when we think about it? Because, some of the buildings we go to that have had royal visits, Mary Queen of Scots, she was halfway around the country, she must have lived in near enough every royal palace near enough, or was held there, let's say. Yeah. How many times does she come through?
But my point exactly like I said with Anne Boleyn and Marilyn Monroe, if you want to look at a more modern day one. Yeah. Because people know the name, they automatically assume. And it's like, I know there's meant to be one of the supposed hauntings at Warwick Castle, and people always assume it's, they assume it's the Kingmaker, Richard Neville. And I'm like, well, how do you know it is? It could just be one of his, you can't see it, because they raised the floor level after, sort of over the last 3-4 years. You only see him from sort of like hip up. You can't see his legs. And I'm sort of saying, well, it could just be it's one of the huntsmen, or you can't assume, unless you've had a one-to-one conversation with them. You can't really assume. You can just say, well, what era they were from, or who it could be. But, I mean, as we know, so much in our game is conjecture anyway. It's trying to put pieces together and come up with a full house. But no, Edward is not meant to haunt Coombe, but I just thought that was an interesting fact, because the fact he was off to have a bit of a scrap with someone who'd originally been his best mate.
I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? That really is interesting when you think about it, because, I look at some of the buildings I've been in over time, and, how would we know? I mean, at the end of the day, wherever I was, Coombe Abbey, wherever, if it was a monk or one of the priors that came back, I wouldn't know who it was unless, like you said, he physically wrote his name down and said, by the way, this is who I am. Yeah. You would just get an energy, you'd just get his feeling. Yeah. Yeah, my point exactly. Point exactly. So, let's jump forward a little bit to something that's reasonably relevant, seeing as it's happening in a couple of weeks. Bonfire night. Okay. And where Bonfire Night comes from. Obviously, we all know about burning the effigy of Guy Fawkes and all that kind of thing. But Coombe Abbey has links with that too. I heard about this one, yes.
I told you about it, didn't I? And you were like, I didn't know that. Yes. So it has links with Guy Fawkes too. So, brief sort of overview of what went on with the gunpowder plot. And I know there's an awful lot of people who probably like to recreate it at the moment. In fact, I think there's a meme going around saying Guy Fawkes the only honest man ever to have entered the Houses of Parliament. Which I can kind of see that point, and I do actually think Guy Fawkes is much maligned. I don't think he wasn't the only one doing it, but for some reason he's the one that we all know about. And we'll talk about what happened. Well, we have a quick conversation about what happened to him, but the background of it was that the then king was the Scottish king, James I, and he was Protestant, but when he first came to power, he was actually quite tolerant of Catholicism, and he allowed the Catholics to sort of keep practicing the way they had been and all that kind of thing. As time progressed, and I think it was about February or March time in 1604, from the research I've done, he started to get a little bit suspicious of Catholics and started to sort of rein them in a bit, what they were able to do. And supposedly this was really kicked off when a Catholic sympathiser sent James's wife a rosary, and that really was the final nail in the Catholic coffin as far as James was concerned. So he started making it very, very hard for them to practice their religion. Guy Fawkes and his crew, although it was really Catesby who was kind of the ringleader, decided that wasn't good enough and they needed to blow up the House of Lords to, if you like, reset the system. I suppose that's one. I'm trying to translate this into non-historical speak. Into basically, they wanted to start the reboot the system, get rid of the people who were, and they knew James was going to be in there at that point. And their plan was to actually put his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, on the throne and turn her into a Catholic puppet.
Mm-hmm.
You with me?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So, as was common practice for monarchy and royalty and people of upper classes, she had been sent away as a young child anyway, and she had actually been sent away to Coombe Abbey to be educated and, as I suppose, have a guardian by one Sir John Harrington, who also was Scottish, hence his links to James, and could actually trace his lineage back to Robert the Bruce, or Robert Bruce. So he was part of James's inner circle, he was very well trusted, and he was the one looking after Princess Elizabeth. She's living at Coombe Abbey. This is 1603 she first went to live there, but obviously this happened in 1604. Now, what basically happened was they planned to kidnap Elizabeth, whisk her away, turn her into a Catholic puppet. The fact that James would be dead, they'd force her onto the throne as their Catholic puppet, so she could run the country as a Catholic country and get back the control over the Protestants.
Yeah.
But what they actually had to do to kidnap her, because Harrington was quite protective over her. I mean, you've got the King's daughter living with you. You're not going to leave her unattended, really, very often, are you?
No.
He'd gone on a hunting trip, and basically she'd been left unsupervised. I'm sure there was, like, staff or whatever living at the Abbey, but she was left unsupervised by anyone with a big sword. And Harrington got wind of what they were about to do, and basically set a trap for the would-be kidnappers, and sent Elizabeth to, there we go, Coventry again, sent Elizabeth to Coventry, and the actual place, not that he sent her to Coventry, he didn't stop talking to her, he actually sent her to the place, and ended up catching the schemers, killed a few ran back to London, and was subsequently killed and executed. I believe there was 8 of the plot schemers were actually executed. They were hung, drawn and quartered.
Okay.
That's a pretty exciting thing to have happened in a place, really. Quite a lot of energy, I would have guessed.
Yeah.
No hauntings.
I was just going to say, I bet there's been no sights,
Nothing. Not a dicky bird. Which surprises me. Especially if I'm sure they do firework displays.
Yeah.
So, I would have thought that could have possibly triggered something, seeing as this place is so synonymous with, when you start reading into it anyway, so synonymous with the legend of the gunpowder plot. Yes.
Yeah, and you see stories like this that they do fascinate me, and then you think, well, wait a minute, we've got an abbot that's, a monk or whatever you wish to call them, that's haunting the buildings, but yet something like that's a very historical classic story, nothing, no sight at all,
and a true story. It's not made up.
Yeah. And again, I've got to say, in my experience of all these times, as far as I know, in any ghost hunt I've done, I've never brought back a king or a queen or a prince or a princess. No. Certainly not. And I don't know, would they want to come back? What was their views? Maybe they're maybe they sit somewhere else. I don't know. But I just find it fascinating that when you get a story like that, literally there is no recalling of it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I was quite intrigued when I found that link. When I was doing the research to write the article, I thought, oh, blimey, this is good. Because I do remember going to a display at the Gunpowder Museum in Waltham Abbey, and it was a display on the gunpowder plot. And they had copies of notes that Fawkes and a few of the others had written firstly how their writing looked before they were tortured, and then how their writing looked literally just before they were executed. And it was actually quite heartbreaking to see how much they'd been broken.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can only but imagine what was done to them before. Being hung, drawn and quartered ain't exactly pleasant, but you can imagine what was done to them beforehand. When you see the difference in the writing, like it's barely legible. And you
can imagine it, can't you? I mean, it must have been awful, really. And I mean, even in terms of what we talk about in terms of Newstead, and I know we liken them very similar to each other because obviously they were basically, and I mean, we know that there were accounts of the final sort of priors who probably didn't want to leave, probably being executed on the front lawn in some way.
Yeah, well, I think Fountains Abbey had one executed there as well.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. So I mean, I was always, as a kid, you thought Guy Fawkes, he was this man who bad man, he wanted to commit treason, blah, blah, blah. But as you start to look into the story, you think, well, he kind of was using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, really. But I can kind of understand, and maybe the way he was treated, it was inevitable, but maybe it could have been done in a better way. I mean, why torture the hell out of someone if you're just going to chop them up into little pieces anyway? Can't really see the point.
Totally.
But like I always say to people, you can never judge history by today's morals and today's society, how we conduct things, because if you did, you'd constantly be absolutely appalled at everything that happened. And at the time, it was what would happen. If you committed treason, you would be hung, drawn and quartered, and you would probably be tortured beforehand. You knew that. You kind of... You live by the sword, you die by the sword, kind of thing.
Yeah, and the rules and the rules and the law were very different in those days, wasn't they? There wasn't, you wouldn't have stood in front of somebody a lot of the time, and they wouldn't have said, "Well, you've been a very naughty boy today," or "a naughty girl," whichever. It was literally, right, well, you've done wrong. You've committed treason, or you've gone against the king, whichever you wish to state. And you wouldn't have got a choice. You wouldn't have got a trial. You would have just been, that's it. Lo and behold, you'd be done with.
Well, I think 100 years earlier, if you'd been caught preaching the wrong religion, you'd have been hung, drawn and quartered in front of people as a martyr. So
totally, yeah.
It's horrific, but it's what it was. But the fact that Coombe Abbey has links to this as well, and quite strong links, seeing as Elizabeth was the one they were planning to get on the throne, which was interesting because she did become a queen. She became the Queen of Bohemia with her husband Frederick, and I found this out, that again, I know there's an awful lot of Princess Diana fans out there, and this isn't meant to be insulting to Princess Diana, but most people think of her as being the Queen of Hearts, or the Princess of Hearts. Elizabeth was the first. That's
an interesting one.
The Queen of Bohemia, Elizabeth Stuart, was actually known as the Queen of Hearts because she was so popular.
Okay.
And that's where it came from, they believe. But again, I'm not meaning to denigrate Princess Diana's memory or anything else, but looking in the Elizabeth Stuart was known as the Queen of Hearts, and the reason I said you got the Hanover link, you following me now? You following me? Her grandson was George the First, George of Hanover.
Of course, of course. Okay, this is interesting now. Okay.
There's a funny kind of serendipity to all this. But, so after the Harringtons left Coombe Abbey, and like I say, no reported hauntings to do with the gunpowder plot. I find that strange. No reported hauntings to do with Harrington, and he sounded like quite a driven man, quite the sort of man who would be very protective over his property as well. No hauntings to do with him.
A very powerful man, I mean, look at what he was sat on. We're not just talking somebody that lived in a little cottage. We're sat on a full-size estate.
Who the king trusted him enough to look after his daughter.
Totally. The wealth, everything was just phenomenal. Really was.
So nothing to do with him, strangely. It then passed into the Craven family after Harrington, who actually had it until 1921, and this is where we start to get a bit interesting again. So, the first Craven was a Lieutenant General William Craven, who was a big supporter of Elizabeth Stuart, now Queen of Bohemia, and in I think it was the 16th early 1640s, he was campaigning for her and her husband Frederick to be re-given the monarchy of Germany, which they'd been booted out of. So he was a big supporter, and she used to come and visit him, apparently, or used to write to him, apparently, because he was a big supporter of hers. Now, in 1649, her brother, Charles I, lost his head, and apparently she basically sort of disowned England as a result. Sort of, can't believe you would do that to my brother. But her kids, she had quite a few children, I think she had 10 or 11, and a few of them were back in England and were being protected because of the fact they were Charles's nieces and nephews. So she is meant to have come back to England eventually, just before she died. So you've got the first Craven. He was very, very enamoured by her, very protective of her, wanted to get her and her husband back on the throne, which is quite interesting. But then it comes to our next ghost story that we hear about with Coombe, and that's of the stable girl. Did you know this was one I was coming to next?
No, I didn't know this one. Which one's this? No, which one's this one?
This is meant to be... Now, some of it, people say it's a stable girl, some say it's a serving girl, but I've seen stable girl mentioned more than serving girl, but the common denominator is she's meant to be a gypsy whose name was Matilda.
Okay.
And supposedly, in the 1800s... one of the Cravens got her pregnant and refused to admit it was theirs, and some say she died in childbirth and the child was stillborn. Some reports say the child was stillborn and she then put a curse on the whole family, and some have said that she was forced to have a C-section and then the baby was taken away and died. Don't know obviously which it could be, but it definitely says the 1800s, and it's definitely one of the Cravens. Now, my issue with this story is, if she was a stable girl, girls didn't do that. Girls didn't work in stables in the 1800s.
Very true, yeah. They
wouldn't have been allowed to wear the trousers. And you can't really work with horses in big skirts. Girls would have worked in the house as serving girls, whether they were gypsies or not. C-sections were plausible. C-sections could have happened. C-sections actually have been going on for, they reckon, 1,000 years, albeit obviously with different varying degrees of success. But it is plausible a C-section could have been done to someone in the 1800s.
Yeah, can agree with that one, yeah.
Dubious, but it could have been done.
Yeah.
Now, so those things are sort of plausible stories. However, I read one account of some I'll say supposed mediums who went in there who said they'd checked the history. Well, I don't know what they've checked, because I've gone through everything with a fine-tooth comb and I cannot find anything to do with it, apart from accounts that people have said, like, it is believed that.
Yeah.
So I thought I'd go back to basics. I checked the newspaper reports. Nothing. I checked birth and marriage, things for a Matilda, who could have been in Coombe Fields or Coombe Abbey or Rugby or anywhere like that around that time. None that would have been the right age. I then went looking at the census records, because obviously if she'd been living there at the time, her name would have been noted on the census records.
Yeah, nothing.
However, obviously census records, I will caveat this, only done every 10 years, so she could have been there in between the 10-year period. I will give people that. But what I found interesting is she's meant to have put a curse on the family that a lot of their children would die young, like hers had. And what I found very interesting is when I was going back through the census records, and you can't find it on everyone, because the problem is, if anyone's ever done research into census records, when you're searching for it, your searching is only as good as what the person who compiled it had written down. So Coombe Abbey could either be Coombe Abbey with one O, Coombe Abbey with two, Coombe Abbey with one O and no E at the end, Coombe Abbey with, or even be down as Coombe Fields, or and I mean the amount of, I used about 6 or 7 different variations to try and find them, and I only found, well, I found the 1841, the 1851, the 1861, and the 1881. Oh, and 1891. And I should have been able to track it back to 1811, but I couldn't find any of them past 1841, even though we know they would have existed. Searching online, and that's part of the problem when you're looking at census records. Is you've got to put in the search things that match the spelling that they would have used. But what I did find interesting is in 1841 there's 35 names listed as being resident at the Abbey. Quite a lot of servants, stable hands, gardener, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
In 1851, there's 54 names, including the Cravens, the family. When it came to 1861, there was only 4. And when it came to 1881, I had 5, all of which were down as servants. And then in 1891, there was 3. 1 caretaker and a couple who were visiting her.
Now that's very strange, because the size of the estate and the wealth of the estate, how would they have managed?
I mean, you could say that when they visited, the other people who lived there weren't actually there at the time, they were out doing something. But I find it very interesting that there was a distinct lack of descendants, if you could say it that way, from about 1851 onwards. A real lack of descendants taking up ownership of the Abbey. But whether this is down to the curse, or whether it was just they were spending more time in London, because they did have a home in London as well, and I found newspaper articles that the William Craven, who would have been there in 1850, so he died, he was 1809 to 1866. He and his wife were in April were preparing to shut up the house and leave a skeleton staff so that they could go to London for the season. So I suppose it's party season. So I guess you could say it depends on when the census was taken as to who would have been in residence. But it was quite marked that in 1851 there's all these people, and gradually it got smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and you see, you would still expect the size of the property, more than 4 or 5 staff there. That's, to me, that's just impossible in a way, because, even if you shut the house down, they'd have still had to maintain gardens and even internally in the house, So, yeah, very weird that. It almost makes you think, was that a period where maybe the family, I don't know, maybe started to lose money, where they had no choice but to start almost withdrawing or drawing back?
I don't know. I mean, in 1891, it would have been William G.R. Craven who owned it. Now, he actually died at Cowes on the Isle of Wight in 1921, and he apparently fell overboard. His body wasn't discovered for a good few days until it washed back ashore.
Right, okay.
So, I who knows? Was he a bit of a playboy? Was he, like you say, did he burn through the... Now, it was after he died that his wife, Cornelia, 2 years later, sold off the entire estate.
Oh, okay.
Now, what I couldn't find is whether that was to pay death duties or anything else. But apparently she sold the entire estate off to a local builder. Which would suggest to me... she needed to get shot of it.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I know the story of Newstead when one of the owners died and the wife was left there on her own, and basically the house went up for auction and Queen Victoria bid for it at the same time and missed it, So
That's a cool story.
Honestly, yeah, phenomenal. Yeah, because apparently at the time, Victoria was up in this area in Sherwood Forest because she wanted a property for Edward at the time. She went for 2 properties and she lost both of them at auction. So you can imagine, her going away very, pardon the expression, huffed, almost going, I'm really not happy. Exactly. So probably was this a similar thing with Coombe where, maybe he died and, she thought, actually, I can't afford this place on my own. And the size of the place as well, bearing in mind.
It is huge. I know we keep saying how big this place is, but if you can imagine, the gardens and the land around it as well, it was a massive estate to run. Yeah. So, but it's just an interesting sort of... I mean, I know as technology improved, just during the 1800s and the 1900s, you needed less staff to run things because mechanisation and all that kind of thing. But bringing us back to Matilda, I searched and searched and searched for anything to do with a Matilda. And the only link to a Matilda I could find to do with Coombe is in a very old book called The Witch and the Maid of Honour, and there is a a Lady Matilda Devereux mentioned attached to Coombe. She was a visitor who came to visit Craven. That's the only sort of link to a Matilda. Plus, as I said, would they have taken on a gypsy girl?
No.
They certainly wouldn't have taken on a female stable hand. It just wouldn't. It wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I couldn't see it. And, you know, Lady Matilda, you know, this was obviously a lady of wealth, of you know,
she was, but I don't think she was in the 1500s. So this is like 300 years before this young stable girl, where the myth goes that she was a gypsy who put a curse on the family for robbing her of her baby. And she's probably the most famous ghost that is mentioned, because people supposedly have seen her in there's supposedly a secret room at Coombe Abbey, and people have seen her face up at the window.
A secret room. Okay. That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah, but that, when you think about what it was, the fact it was an abbey, and the fact priest holes, all that kind of thing, is that really not that strange, if you ask me, that there could be a quasi-secret room. There's probably quite a few secret areas that maybe have been changed now. It's a hotel, but I don't know. So when you investigated there, what did you find?
Well, I mean, when we did it, I mean, I remember we worked in the what they use as their medieval dining room when we was using it, you know, and there was me and Karen Dallman in there, and you know, we had some really, really good activity in that room. You know, we were using the Ouija boards, we got a lot of movement, we got a lot of things happening. And, you know, I've got to say, and bearing in mind that would have been probably one of the more outbuildings, probably more of like, I'd have thought more servant staff quarters than the house. But certainly we found something out there. Now, I'll be honest, that's the place probably where I would expect to find activity, because, you know, a lot of them was young characters. They may be a bit rowdy, a bit excitable, you know, probably did have a few bare knuckle fights or whatever because they were passing the time of day, etc., etc. So I would expect to find something out there. I have to say, in terms of walking around the house myself, did I feel spooked at any time? No, I was in awe of this fantastic building, but I've got to say, you know, I didn't exactly feel spooked by it. You know, I mean, I remember we found a tomb inside the house. You know, it was meant to be like a sarcophagus sort of tomb, but you know, then later on we found that actually it wasn't real anyway. You know, and so, you know, again, it's this prop thing, isn't it? You know, and we see this all too often, don't we, in buildings nowadays?
Psychological stimuli sort of thing.
Yeah, you know, something's been bought in, or somebody's seen something and bought it across. I mean, you know, we've got the same again at Newstead. We have the monument. We don't have the tomb. We have the monument off the top of the tomb of the Sir John Byron, you know, the first Sir John Byron. But his body still lies in the church at Colwick. All that we've got is basically the dressing off the top of it, you know, the statue of him and his wife laid side by side. But, you know, have I ever seen him there? Not that I know of. You know, and I think there is a lot of that. I think sometimes, you know, when people go into some of these old haunted buildings like Coombe Abbey, it's very, how do I say it? You know, even when you're walking up to it, this place just almost, you look up and it is massive. It is huge. I mean, I can't remember now how many floors, but 4 or 5 floors, something like that must be. And, you know, this feeling just overwhelms you, you know, and I think your imaginations at time can run rife. And we find this on ghost hunts. You know, I know I've done experiments before where, you know, you get everybody in a dark room and you go, can anybody see that? And somebody will go, yeah, I can see it. And then lo and behold, somebody else go, well, I can see it. And you think, actually, I can't see anything. Yeah, you know, and you've given people this insight. So, you know, I love some of the stories like what we're talking about the royalty. And I think, gosh, imagine getting a royal through the Ouija board coming to talk to us. And, you know, I'm James the First, you know, I'm Charles the Second, whatever, and this is what happened. This is how it worked for me. But it never seems to happen. You know, all we ever tend to get is, oh, we've got the cook, oh, we've got a servant boy, or we've got, you know, it's almost like the lower entities, you know, I would refer to them, or the lower energies. I don't want to say entity, but, you know, almost the people who, they would have worked there. probably, yes, it was their home, because they didn't have anywhere else to go. They had no money, so they had to stick with that job.
Your average Joe. Your average
exactly,
Joe.
yeah. Exactly. But, what about the families that own the house? Surely they must have had some horrific deaths. There must have been certain illnesses that would have wiped out the family. Or, we hear of stories, don't we, where, a husband and wife probably lost every child or lost 3 or 4 children. But we never seem to get them back to, to prove a presence anymore.
Yeah. Interesting point. Well, from what the research I've done, and I think Coombe has got the potential to be active. Yeah. I do wonder, as it is a hotel, what people could have brought in with them that people think is now resident to Coombe. So that's one thing I would say when you're investigating that. Be wary of that. It is a hotel at the end of the day, so you don't know what stragglers people are unawares, or possibly knowingly, bringing in with them when they come to stay there. You never know who's hitchhiked into their space, I suppose, for want of a better term. Very true. And there must have been, numerous stories of people having maybe children and getting rid of them, babies and getting rid of them, all these sort of stories, And I would guarantee it's a hotel, it's had the odd suicide as well. I mean,
more than likely.
I don't know a hotel that hasn't, if I'm completely honest with you. If you talk to anyone who's worked in the hotel industry, they will say, we've had at least one. I've had at least one.
Yeah.
So, there's going to be that there. There were deaths in the 1970s in the sort of the land area. But it's interesting, the fact as well. One thing I didn't mention when I was saying about the Craven, where there was the most people on the census, when did I write it down? I wrote the dates down. I think it was 1850 to 1899 had the most newspaper reports mentioning Coombe Abbey as well. So it was all around the time this one Craven, he seemed to have been the go-getter, if you like. So I'm and it went downhill after him. So who knows? But I'm not convinced about the Matilda story. Maybe there was a serving girl. Maybe she did get pregnant. Again, that wouldn't have been uncommon.
Yeah,
it's a classic story, though,
isn't it? Yeah, it's a classic story. We always find this, don't we? Where there'll be, I don't know, the Lord had a relationship with the servant or whatever. And again, is there a lot of proof of it? Because it certainly, I can't imagine it would have been well documented, put it that way. And it's not the sort of thing as a lord of a house you'd really want to be documented, surely. No,
but it kind of yeah, you're right. The documentation of it is scarce, but it is plausible, very plausible. Like you say, a lot of the people who worked downstairs wouldn't have had the money to walk away.
No.
If they'd walked away, they'd have ended up in the workhouse. So they would put up with things that possibly they shouldn't have to put up with. I don't know, but I mean, it's an amazing place, and if I was given the chance to investigate there, I would.
It's stunning. It is absolutely stunning. It really is. I mean, even put aside the stories, the building itself is just huge. It's mammoth. You could walk for hours along corridors, and at the end of the day, I mean, what a fantastic home to have lived in at that time, and that clearly shows you wealth, like Warwick Castle, for instance. All these sort of buildings, even places like Dudley Castle. Massive. Wealthy properties, these really were, but then suddenly we go through this period of, probably around the Second World War time, where suddenly a lot of them started falling into very poor condition, and probably due to things like inheritance tax, family losses, families couldn't afford to keep it going even though they tried, and eventually they ended up probably just walking away from most of them.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. I would have said the First World War is when you started. Just before, around the First World War, because so many of the young men, and so you would have got a lot of these families, their sons would have been expected to go away and fight. just because they had, they came from landed gentry. They'd go in as officers, obviously, but they'd still be expected. So you had a whole generation wiped out who would have kept it going, following. I think that's why so many of them did become military VAD hospitals and all that kind of thing, because of the fact they had to do something. And you look at, digressing slightly, but you look at Highlands House in Chelmsford. Not so much World War One; it was actually a VAD hospital, but in World War Two, the couple who owned it, they weren't sort of a sir or a lady or whatever, but they were wealthy. Their son Jock died he was a Spitfire pilot, and he died, actually he wasn't even in combat, it was a training flight, he died. So you've got a lot of that kind of thing happening. So at the end of the day, it was a very masculine society. It wasn't it wasn't an equal society. The blokes died, who was going to take over running the estate? Well, obviously girls couldn't do it. So and I think also, I wonder if things like technology coming in and how they would have earned their money changed. Even those who would have been MPs, that changed in the 1800s. How you became an MP and who could be an MP, whereas before it was only the rich who did it. Well, that changed as things changed, and it was almost like I don't really know why. I can't put my finger on it, but I think death duties probably didn't help in the 20th century with a lot of these places.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's what started to cause the problem for people, wasn't it? And the upkeep of them, obviously, I'm sure they had a similar scenario what we have nowadays, where bills started to increase. And people, you look at the census, what we were just looking at there for Coombe, where suddenly you went from 50 staff down to 5.
Yep.
So there must have been some sort of reason for it.
And if I was able to get to the records office in Warwickshire, I'd probably be able to look into it a bit deeper. But unfortunately, I'm limited to what I can find online. So, well, thank you so much, Barry. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I hope you enjoyed it as well.
I've enjoyed that. I really have, because I think, it's nice when we actually look outside the box of hauntings. And, the amount of times when we've all been to venues and suddenly people are picking up, the usual hauntings, let's call it that, your monks, people like that. And you think, well, these places were family homes as well. What happened to all the family? What happened to all the children that must have lived there? And also, like what we were just saying, people that probably where there was an affair with the servant girl and maybe she lost the child, or, we hear numerous stories of it, don't we?
Yep.
So I enjoyed that. That was enjoyable, and thank you that we've looked at it in a different basis.
You're very welcome. I enjoy doing that. I enjoy sort of looking at things in a different aspect. So what have you got going on at the moment?
Oh gosh, well, I've just come back from, as I say, Germany, from the spiritual convention. I've got over the next few weeks, obviously it's half term, so we're open at the Abbey every day, but we've also got our ghostly tales at night. And then for me, over Halloween, on my own private events, I've got a lot of events which I've called Experiencing the Paranormal, which isn't doing ghost hunts, but is talking to people about the equipment that we use, some of the tools and the toys that we use, and how to use them and what to do. So, people will be having an experience themselves of table tipping, glass moving, using the Ouija boards, talking boards, whichever you wish to call them. So lots coming up, over the next few weeks, especially the Halloween, because it's the biggest period for us.
Yeah.
And, let's get all those spooks and ghosts and ghouls out haunting us all.
Exactly. Well, I'm sure you will agree. It's always a pleasure talking with Barry. Even if I get him off the subject of his beloved Newstead Abbey, he can still talk. It's always good.
I can. It is, and it's nice because we actually look at things in different ways, don't we?
Yep.
There's so much ghost hunting what I enjoy, and then there's ghost hunting that actually I just think, I want to talk about something different at times. And I love the history side of life. I think there's some tremendous history out there, what we've all got, especially in this country, and so much of it that we take for granted.
When I told you about the gunpowder link to Coombe, your voice went up 2 octaves at the time. Went, really? And I was like, yes. So I knew you were quite sort of, wow, okay. So yeah, you are well. I mean, you do all the history stuff at Newstead, don't you? So you've got to have a passion for it. You can't just limit yourself to one particular building. You have to have a broader knowledge of history in general to be able to talk about one place. So
yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for allowing us to look at a show ghost hunting and shows in a different way.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Well, that has been the lovely Barrie John joining us on tonight's show, talking about Coombe Abbey and maybe a different way to look at some of the information that you garner. If you don't want to do that, do what you want. I'm not going to hold you to it. But if you do want to learn a little bit more, do a bit of a research on the history and see whether things are plausible. But like I say, you never know what's been brought into a place. But don't believe everything you read. That's all I can say. Well, I'm not around next week. I've got the week off, and I'll be back in beginning of November with another Haunted Histories for you. In the meantime, don't forget to check out PSH Radio tomorrow night. Check out all the other shows on Parasearch, on YouTube even, which you can click like, share and subscribe, or even on Spreaker. All our back shows can all be downloaded as podcasts. But on that note, thank you ever so much for listening. Have a good evening. Sleep tight. And don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.